11. Wednesday, December 14th, 2022. The 10th day since we had beaten the boss of the first floor, and the 38th day since we'd first been trapped inside this game of death. The collective frontline players, including me and Asuna, had finished progressing through the massive labyrinth tower, brimming with muscled bullmen, and finally reached the chamber of the second floor boss. Our raid, made up of 8 different parties, was a total of 47, just under the limit allowed by the game. Despite the loss of Diovel the Knight, and those too shocked by his death to take part, the group had grown, thanks to the addition of the 5 warriors from the Legend Braves. Lind, the scimitar user, formerly Diovel's right-hand man, led his blue group with 3 parties totaling 18 members. Once we'd cleared the second floor, they initiated the guild quest on the next floor up. They were planning to establish the Dragon Knights Guild. The Knights part was clearly an homage to the spirit of the fallen leader, but I didn't know where the dragon came from. With another 18 was the Green Group, gathered around their opposition to the beta testers, led by Kabao, who swung a one-handed sword, just like me. They'd already decided on their own guild name, the Einkrad Liberation Squad. That accounted for 6 parties, 36 members. And next was Agile, the massive axe wielder, and his 3 friends, all muscled like he was, for some reason. Asuna the Fencer, the only female in the group, and then Kirito, the evil beater. That made 42, with the 5 added members of the Legend Braves. That made a total of 47, just one under the limit. I sat in the corner of a large safe zone, just outside the boss chamber, watching the separate groups check their equipment and distribute potions. I leaned over to Asuna, who was once again wearing her trademark hood, and whispered, "Just one more, and we'd have a full raid." True. I guess he didn't make it in time. We got to the boss chamber a lot faster than I expected. It's a tough quest to beat in just 3 days, I bemoaned. Asuna shot me a dirty glare. Well, from what I hear, it even took a certain someone 3 days and 2 nights to finish it. 3 days earlier, in the village of Turan, near the labyrinth, I had given Nezha a special kind of ranged weapon and a map. The map pointed out the location of an NPC hidden in the Rocky Mountains along the outer perimeter of the second floor, and the secret passageway to reach him. This NPC was none other than the bearded martial arts skill master who had drawn the whiskers on my cheeks and turned me into Kirimon. I asked Nezha if he was prepared to give up on the weapon crafting skill he'd spent so much time on and take up martial arts instead. The weapon I'd picked up in the second floor labyrinth required both the throwing knives and martial arts skill to use. Abandoning a skill was not an easy decision to make, even when it was only a day or 2 of experience being lost. In the case of blacksmith, working with the skill upward was both a matter of time and considerable money. In other MMOs, it was easy as rolling an alternate character, but now SAO was 1 character per account system. By virtue of our predicament, that wasn't an option. The most rational choice was to wait until he reached the level that would open up another skill slot. Another choice might be to remove the inventory expansion skill that had gave him extra rooms for his items. But instead, in exchange for the weapon and the map, I demanded that Nezha remove his blacksmithing skill. In SAO's current state, attempting to balance crafting and combat was too dangerous. A player venturing into the field needed to focus everything on his control and maximizing the chances of survival, from his skill choices, to his equipment, to his inventory. Plenty of even the most well-prepared players had lost their lives because they were missing that bit of attack strength or armor value, or 1 more potion. Nezha took just 1 more deep breath before accepting his harsh demands.
"As long as I can be a swordsman here, I don't need anything else," he said, and then smiled and added, "But I suppose using this won't make me a swordsman."
Surprisingly, it was Asuna who answered, "Everyone fighting to help beat this game is a swordsman. even a pure crafter. We had guided Nezha past the battle to the entrance of the second passage and left him there. His level was high enough, and I considered inviting him to join the boss battle if his martial arts training finished in time, but it seemed 3 days was enough for him to break that rock. There was no need to rush. Nezha wouldn't be risking danger by attempting the weapon fraud again. He'll be a big help in being the third floor, I'm sure. It's a pretty good weapon if you can master it, and he'll be able to find a spot in some guild or other. One aside from the Braves, I'm guessing. Yes, I hope so, Asuna agreed. We looked across the safe zone at a group of 5. Orlando was wearing his usual pointed bassinet helmet and a kneel blade. Beowulf was the short man with a double-handed sword next to him, and the skinny spearman was Kunkulian. There were also 2 others that weren't present during the battle against the bulbous bow. Gilgamesh, who fought with a hammer and shield, and Enkidu, who was outfitted with leather armor and daggers. At this morning's meeting, I detected a mixture of unease and discontent among the legend braves. I had to assume it was because of the disappearance of Nezha, their 6th member. If they had been in an established guild, they could use the location trackers to find him. But here on the 2nd floor, guilds were nothing more but names. I could understand their concern, but I was under no obligation to explain the situation to them. After all, they'd forced Nezha to undertake a week-long string of dangerous scams that easily could have led to his execution if any was exposed to the public. That's all nice and good, Kirito, but we shouldn't be spending our time worrying about the state of other parties. Oh? Why? I blinked. She sighed in exasperation. Lin said we'd put the raid group together just before the boss fight, but think about it. There are 3 parties for the blue team, and 3 parties for the green team, and 1 for the Legend Braves, and probably one last one for the Agile group. That makes 8. Oh, good point. I hadn't given it any thought since she'd mentioned it, but 8 parties was the maximum for a raid. In the boss fight, we'd have a lower number, and Asa and I got to be on our own, leftover party. But that wouldn't be an option this time. Without any magic, SEO didn't have the usual full raid heals and buffs. So it was quite possible for extra people to take part in the battle outside of the raid. The problem was that being outside the group meant you couldn't see the HP of other members, and they couldn't see yours. It made gauging the proper timing of potion rotations very tricky. I had to make sure that Asuna at least made her way into Agile's party. I looked around the axe warrior's distinct shape. "Hey, you two! It's good to see you again!" Came a baritone voice from behind me. I turned around to see the very man I was looking for. His craggy face split into a grin, the light shining off his bald head. "I hear you two have been paired up. I guess I should congratulate you." We're not a pair, I tried to say, but Asuna set the record straight. "We're not a pair. It's just a temporary partnership. Nice to see you, Agile." Agile smiled again and looked at me, raising an eyebrow. It was a cool gesture, but I felt it was as though he meant it in a consoling way. I hastily cleared my throat. Yes, that's right. So I guess we're about to finalize the raid structure. Since we're almost at the absolute limit for 8 parties, I was planning to ask them if they would take Asuna in their party, but again, I didn't get the chance to finish. "Yeah, that's what I came to ask you about. There are 4 of us, so why don't you join our group?" It was such a breezy, careless invitation that I couldn't help but hesitate. Well, that's really generous of you. But are you sure? I mean, given my standing. Asuna sighed, and Agile shrugged his shoulders and threw up his hands. That gesture, combined with his appearance, was clearly not Japanese. But his command of the language was perfect, so there was a strange mixture of exoticism and familiarity about the man that made him both fascinating and charismatic. "What? Do they call you a beta?" it's only a tiny percentage of people who actually call you that. Even the word beater sounded fresh and new coming from his lips. Most people, including me, pronounce it with a flat intonation, like cheater, but he stressed the B and softened a ter, which made it almost sound like a cool title to have. We actually have our own nickname for you. Really? What is it? Asuna asked. Agile glanced at her and grinned. The Man in Black, or Blackie, she snorted. I wasn't exactly thrilled with the epithet. I hadn't chosen the color of coat I looted from the Cobalt Lord, but even more startling to me that she'd actually laughed. I peered into her hood in curiosity. Asuna quickly composed her expression, gave me a familiar glare before continuing. Thanks for the offer, Agile. I suppose we'll take you up on it. Me and Blackie. Oh, come on. You're not going to run with that, are you? I protested. Asuna replied. Blackie. As in the prompters who wear all black during the play, right? Sounds perfect for a guy who hates being in the spotlight. Oh, I see. But that's not exactly the same. I mean, if you'd prefer that I just call you Mr. Kirito all the time, I can do that. Like I said, it's not exactly the same. Agile, who grinned as he watched our bickering, burst out laughing at that point. If you two are in that tune, then I'm leaving the switching timing up to you. The four of us will focus on tanking. You guys do the damage. He held out both hands, and Asuna took his right, while I took his left. I bowed briefly to the other three men behind him and received waves and thumbs up in return. I hadn't talked with them much in the first boss battle, but they all seemed to be as good-natured as Agile. I accepted Agile's party request and noted the 6 HP bars that lined up the left side of my view, just as we hit 15 minutes until the battle would begin. The noise of conversations died down toward the front, so I turned to see what the two players were now standing before the massive doors to the boss chamber. One of them was Lind, decked out in silver armor, blue cape, and a scimitar at his waist. The other was Kabao, with his dark armor and moss green jacket. Ugh, not another double leader situation, I groaned. Isn't there only one leader by definition within the system? Asuna asked. That's a good point. As if sensing our confusion, Lin raised a hand and spoke loudly to the group. Unlike the area outside the first floor boss chamber, this was a safe zone, so there was no fear of Tauruses coming out to investigate the noise. Well, it's time. Let's start forming the raid. First, an introduction. I'm Lind, chosen to be your leader today. Greetings, everyone. Before I could even wonder how Kabao would willingly give up his control, the cactus-headed man interjected. Only chosen 'cause you won the coin flip. Half the gathering laughed at this, while the other half looked upset. Lind shot Kabao a dirty glare, but he did not respond to the bait. The fact that we're already here, just 10 days after opening this floor, is a testament to your skill and dedication. If you lend me your help, there is no way we can fail to beat this boss. Let's finish the day on the 3rd floor. He raised a fist, and all of those who didn't laugh at Kabao's jibe roared in approval. With his rousing speech and long hair, formerly brown but now dyed blue, Lin seemed to be fully accepting the role of Diavel's heir. I couldn't help but feel that here and there, hints of self-consciousness that his predecessor never displayed peeked through the facade. Now, let's form the raid. Of the 8 parties, the Dragon Knights will form the team A, B, and C. Kabao's Liberation Squad will make up teams D, E, and F. And Team G will be Orlando's Braves. And Team H, he looked to us in the very back. For an instant, his breezy smile seemed to vanish when his eyes met mine. But he looked past me just as quickly. Will be the rest of you. Teams A through F will concentrate on the boss, while Team G and H handle the mobs. This news did not come as a surprise to me. What was surprising, however, was the voice that spoke up in response.
Hang on a moment.
It wasn't Agile, and certainly wasn't Asuna. It was the leader of the group of 5 on the far wall, Orlando. When he spoke, the eyes staring out beneath his bassinet visor were just as piercing as when they'd nearly seen through my hiding ability outside the bar.
We're here to fight the boss. If you want us to rotate around, I might understand, but we're not going to just hang back and deal with mobs.
His brassy voice echoed off the walls and died out, the ensuing lull filled by several murmuring blue and green players. I could make out mutters of, "Who do they think they are?" and "bloody newcomers." Then it all clicked into place for me. With the disappearance of Nezha, Orlando and his team had lost a huge source of income. This was their chance to leap out to the head of the clearers. The money earned by the raid party was equally shared between all members, but the experience points and skill boosts were not. The enormous store of experience points the boss was worth would be distributed by the amount of damage done, or blocked, and the skill proficiency gained by attacking a powerful enemy was far beyond that of a normal foe. None of that went to them if they didn't attack the boss directly. The 5 Braves had upgraded their equipment to about the maximum it could be at this point, but their player levels would be below average of the raid. I probably saw this boss battle as their best chance to close that gap, and yet disagreeing with the raid leader's orders wasn't going to get them anywhere. The scene could have easily turned into an ugly shouting match, but the blue and green players didn't let it get any worse than Whiskers. I suspected that was due to the powerful aura the Legend Braves were exuding. Level, stats, and skill proficiencies were all hidden variables, not exposed to the public. But equipment power was different. Weapon and armor augmentations close to the limit began to glow with a depth of that reinforced their value. At the present moment, the best any player, including me, could do was upgrade their weapon, and perhaps their shield, to that glowing state. But the Braves were a different story. With the massive sum of coal they reaped in the past week, they had been able to buy full sets of excellent equipment and power it all up. All of their gear was glowing as if under a powerful buff spell, and it created a strong impression that these 5 men were not to be trifled with. Of course, equipment strength was not at all what it was in the game. More important than anything in SAO was personal experience and ability to react and adjust. But in the battle ahead against the Baron General Taurus, every value was important, especially armor strength. This was because General Baron used an elite version of the Taurus race's special attack. "All right, in that case, Team G can join the fight against the boss," Lin said stiffly. I looked up and found myself staring right into the blue-haired man's eyes again. While his hairstyle might have been the same as the one worn by the breezy, affable Diavel, Lind seemed to have a significantly more obstinate side to him. He held my gaze at this time and said, "I might be one monster, but the intel says that it's not your average mob, but more of a mid-level boss on its own. Plus, maybe it's only the one, but we don't know that for sure. Maybe that's a lot to ask of a single party." The prior intelligence they were referring to was, of course, the second floor boss edition of Argo Strategy Guide, which appeared just yesterday in Talan. It held the attack patterns and weak points of the boss, and its attendant mobs, but the disclaimer on the cover said all information was based on the beta test. The first floor boss used a katana skills that hadn't been there in the beta, and it led the death of Diavel the Knight. We had to assume that there were alterations since the beta here, as well. In a worst case scenario, there might be 2 or more NATO Colonel Tauruses accompanying the Baron instead of just one. But Lin actually agreed with Agile's rebuttal. "Of course, I have no intention of repeating the mistakes of the first floor. If we spot any difference in the patterns listed in our prior intelligence, we will immediately retreat and rethink our plan. If the attendant mob is too much for one party to handle, we'll send another team to help. Will that do?" It was about as much as we could hope for at this stage. Agile murmured an affirmation, and Asuna and I let out a breaths we'd been holding in. Next came a review of the boss attack patterns and final check of each team's individual strategy, leaving just 2 minutes until the scheduled time of 2 o'clock. That was only a general guideline, so nothing was stopping us from beginning the fight slightly before or after the hour. Lin raised his hand and said, "All right, it's a bit early, but..." Suddenly, he was cut off by a familiar phrase from Kabal, who had, somewhat surprisingly, kept quiet this entire time. "Now hang on just a sec." "What is it, Kabal?" "You've been basing everything on the strategy guide so far, Lind. Now, all this info's coming from the info dealer who ain't even been in the boss room, right? Is that really good enough for us?" Lin's mouth twisted in displeasure. "I won't claim it's perfect, but it's better than nothing, isn't it? What is your alternative? Are you going to walk in there and check out the boss for yourself?" Now, it was the green-clad Liberation Squad that bristled in anger, but Kabao simply smiled confidently. "What I'm saying is, we don't got at least one person here who's seen this boss for himself. So, why don't we get his take on it?" "What?" I took a step back and to the left to hide behind Asuna, but Kabal lifted his right hand and pointed straight at me. Dozens of eyes turned in my direction, and Asuna callously stepped aside to avoid them. "What do you say, Black Beater? Why don't you offer us some advice on the boss battle?" he bellowed. I couldn't read his expression to see what he was really thinking. "What do you think he's doing?" I muttered quietly, but Asuna could only shrug. I had heard that Cabal's Einkrad Liberation Squad rallied around the resistance to the former beta testers as a means to compete with the testers who rushed out to monopolize the game's best resources. They aggressively recruited new members from the thousands left down in the town of beginnings, and distributed money and items fairly, and planned to conquer the game through sheer numbers. At least, according to Gabal's theory. So, what did he stand to gain by giving a known ex-tester a platform? You'd think it was clearly some kind of a trap. But there was something in the cactus-haired swordsman's eyes that could be taken as honest fervor. "If that looks an act, you're one hell of an actor," I muttered to myself. 1, 2, 3 steps forward, and I had proper view of every face in the raid. Let me just make this clear. I only know the boss from the beta test as well. So, it's totally possible that something or everything about this boss has been changed. As I spoke, the muttering players eventually fell silent. Even Lind, who I figured would interrupt, did not speak. But I can say that the regular Tauruses in the labyrinth use the exact same attacks that they did in the beta. So I think it's certainly that the boss will use a sword skill that are an extension of that pattern. As you just discussed, you want to evade when he goes into his motion. But what's most important is how you react when you take the first hit. Avoid getting hit with double debuffs at all costs. In the beta, every player that got stunned and then playeralized pretty much died. I stopped myself from saying. At any rate, if you stay calm and watch his hammer, you can avoid the second hit. As long as we take that into account, this lineup can beat the boss without any casualties. Nothing I said couldn't be found in Argo's strategy guide, but virtually all players present nodded in understanding when I was done. As usual, Kabao expressions was cipher to me, but Lind had a look of surprise. He clapped his hands briskly. "All right, everyone, avoid the second hit. Now let's get started." He turned around and faced the giant set of doors, and loudly drew his scimitar, holding it aloft. "We're going to crush the second floor boss!" The dim corridor shook with the roar of the gathering. Blue hair waving, his left hand pushing the door open, Lind looked very much like Diovel had in the same exact moment back in the first floor. 12. Monster attacks against players fell under two general categories. One was a direct attack that dealt HP damage. The other was an indirect attack that did not cause direct damage, but occasionally posed a significant threat. In other words, debuffs. Akihiko Kayaba, the designer of this game of death, at least had a minimum of sympathy for new players, for he did not grant any of the kobolds in the first floor labyrinth debuff attacks. The delay effect that led to Diovel's death was a debuff in a way, but it was in an effect that occurred at a high likelihood when suffering multiple consecutive attacks, and wasn't a special skill that the Kobold Lord could use at will. Which meant that Tauruses that dwelt in the second floor labyrinth were the player's first real experience with serious, regular debuffs. "Here it comes!" I cried, recognizing that the double-handed hammer was being lifted straight aloft. The rest of my party called out their acknowledgement and jumped backward. The hammer stopped high overhead for an instant, its wide surface glowing with a brilliant yellow sparks. Vroom! With a roar so fierce, it might as well have been a long-range attack of its own. The beast brought down the hammer. The mass of metal, rippling with lightning, slammed against the dark stone floor. It was the Taurus race's special debuffing ability, Numbing Impact. No one was standing within the direct damage range of the blow, of course, but there was also a narrow sparking tendrils that extended out from the impact point. One of them shot toward me along the floor, fading out until it just barely licked the end of my boot. Instantly, I felt an unpleasant prickle at my toes. Fortunately, I was just on the outside range of the debuff, so there was no stun icon showing beneath my HP bar. Everyone else kept farther away from the shockwave, so no one else were affected. "Full power attack!" I shouted, and 6 of us fanned out in the semicircle around the Taurus, enclosed. Each person unleashed a strong sword skill on their weapons repertoire. Agile's two-handed axe, his crewmates' similar weapons, Asuna's windflare, and my Neelblade blasted the beast with an array of colored lights. The Bullman's 3-part HP gauge finally emptied its first bar and opened the second. "I think we can do this," Asuna shouted from her familiar position to my left. "Yeah, just don't get overconfident. Once we get the 3rd bar, he'll start using consecutive numbing attacks. Plus," I raised my voice to ensure Agile's group heard me, "based on the first floor battle, we should assume that there might be a new attack when we hit the last bar. If that happens, we all pull back." "Got it!" The Taurus recovered from its delay, and at the same time of our skill cooldown ended. Agile's tanks recognized that the attack would be a sideways blow and took defensive stances along its trajectory. Asa and I hung back, waiting for the right moment to counter. Just over 5 minutes have passed in the battle against the boss. So far, our team was performing well. None of us had suffered the numbering impact effect, and none had taken the heavy damage. The 4 tanks were closing HP with each attack they blocked. Of course, the pace of the damage was slow enough that they were making do with 1-man pot rotation so far. And yet, the fact that our battle was going so well meant hardly anything. The blue-skinned, bull-headed beast that Team H faced right now was the only NATO Colonel Taurus, an extra thrown-in boss monster to the fight. A distraction at worst. "Evade! Evade!" came a somewhat panicked scream from the other side of the vast boss chamber. When I had the chance, I glanced over to the heads of the dozen players to see a frightfully large shadow. A bristly, crimson-red pelt enveloped rippling muscles. His waist was covered with luxurious golden cloth, but in keeping with the Taurus's tradition, his upper half was bare. The chain dangling over his shoulders also made of gold. The top of it, the golden battle hammer in his hands, shone with a dazzling brilliance. Coloring aside, Colonel Nato might as well have been a body double of Baron, but there was a couple of other major differences. Size. General Baron, the boss of the second floor, was at least twice the size of NATO. Because of the physical height limit of the ceilings in the labyrinths of Einkrad, Baron was not as tall as the mammoth bulbous bough that prowled the landscape, but there was no escaping the primal fear inspired by a 16-foot beast man. Even the Kobold Lord from the first floor felt huge. He was the only 7 feet tall and change. Naturally, General Baron's golden hammer was massive as well, its powerful head size of a barrel. When he lifted it, the surface shot golden sparks. The tank's attackers pulled back and won in accordance with Lin's orders. Baron's roar was approximately twice as fierce as NATO's, and he smashed the floor. Even at our distance, we could feel the shockwave, which followed by a burst of sparks. Again, the effective range was twice that of his subordinate. It was Baron's unique skill, numbing denotation. The queuing up motion was very easy to identify, but the blast radius was so wide that 2 members failed to get the safe distance, and their feet were swallowed by golden sparks. The lightning wrapped around their limbs, demobilized them. The stun effect, one of the most common debuffs of many of the game, though not one to be overlooked. The stun effect caused the Taurus's numbing attacks lasted 3 seconds, and unlike many debuffs, it wore off automatically. But while 3 seconds might not feel long against garden variety mobs, it was a lifetime against a deadly floor boss. I was keenly aware of the fear and panic those stunned warriors were feeling. 1 second, 2 seconds, and just before the third, one stunned fighter dropped his short spear to clatter onto the ground. It was a fumble, a secondary debuff that sometimes occurred in the midst of a stun. In the next instant, the soldier was free, and the blue-shirted member of Lin's group bent over to pick up his weapon. "No! Get back! Here comes the next one!" I wanted to yell, but I held it in. He wouldn't hear me at this distance, and my companions in Team H would confuse it for an order directed at them. After a brief but powerful slant to Colonel NATO's ribs, I looked to see General Barons raising his hammer again. Thwam! A second numbing denotation. The hammer struck at the same spot as the last one, and more yellow lightning shot forth. Again, they swallowed the spearman's attempted to pick up his weapon. But while he'd been standing upright last time, he fell on the floor at this distance. The visual effect that surrounded his avatar was not yellow, but pale green. This was not a stun, but a more powerful and dangerous debuff, paralysis. It was true terror of the Taurus's numbing skills. The second hit in succession would turn the stun of paralyzing effect. Unlike a stun, paralysis did not disappear after a few seconds. It wasn't indefinite either, but even the weakest effects could last 10 minutes, a full 600 seconds. Obviously, no one could survive a battle while prone to that length of time. No healing items were necessary. The main methods of recovery were healing potions of purification crystals, the later impossible to find until later in the game, so potions were the only choice. However, paralysis left only the dominant hand of the player able to move, and slowly at that, so even pulling out a bottle of a pouch was a trial. Crawling out of the boss's attack range was completely out of the question. I told them not to pick up their weapons, but wait until they were sure the boss wasn't going to attack twice. But there was no use to complaining to myself. Besides, picking up a dropped weapon was just human instinct. I couldn't count on the number of times I'd done the same thing and suffered additional hits during the beta. I only learned to deal with that particular challenge with a cool head once I gained Quick Change mod, so I could pick up call replacement from my inventory. Baron callously targeted the paralyzed spearman and prepared to stomp him with a massive foot. Fortunately, his party members quickly intervened to pull him out of harm's way. I heaved a sigh of relief, but when I saw where they were taking him, my eyes bulged. Lined up along the back wall were already 7 to 8 players, clutching green potions in their stiff hands, waiting for the effect to wear off. The entire time, we'd been carefully chipping away at Colonel NATO. A large number of the main force was suffering from secondary numbing. Things aren't going well in the main fight. Agile rumbled as he returned from his potion rotation. I quickly responded, "Yes, but the more they fight, the more they'll get accustomed to the rhythm. I haven't seen any differences from the beta, so I think we'll be all right." I was about to finish, but Asuna cut me off with a sombering note. "But Kirito, if any more of them get paralyzed, it'll make a temporary retreat much harder." I tensed and clenched the handle of my anneal blade. The weapon couldn't fail unless I intentionally dropped it, or external factors caused me to fumble it. But my subconscious was working in overdrive after witnessing the prior scene with the spearman. The boss chamber in Aincrad, at least as far as I'd seen it, did not lock the players inside once the battle had begun. If things got hairy, it was always possible to beat the hasty retreat. That didn't mean it was a simple matter, of course, but there was a considerable took off running at once. The boss would catch up to us in no time and cause a delay, stunning and ultimately death. So in a way, escaping from the boss chamber required a trickier coordinated effort than actually fighting the adversary. Could we even pull it off, burdened by a large number of paralyzed players? For one thing, lifting an immobile player in your arms to carry them out required a significant strength value. I couldn't lift Asuna up from my skinny arms when she had passed out in the first floor labyrinth. I had to drag her out using a sleeping bag, an emergency measure still fresh in my memory. From what I could see, about 4/5 of Lind and Kabao's forces were balanced out and spread first fighters, with only a few pure strength tanks. As Asuna pointed out, if many more players got paralyzed, it would be much harder to disengage. "We might need to reinforce and prioritize dealing with the numbing," I said, stepping out of the way of the 3-part hammer combo from NATO. Asuna nimbly matched my steps beside me. "I agree, but if we start calling out orders in the main force, it's only going to confuse the chain of command. We need to get ideas to Lin's ears." Her hazel eyes darted over the HP of Teams H and Colonel NATO. "We can handle him with just 5. Go and talk to Lind, Kirito." Are you sure?" "Yeah, no problem," boomed Agile, who must have overheard. "The 4 of us can handle guarding for now. You're easily got 2 or 3 minutes to go talk to him." I turned back to look at the chocolate-skinned warrior and his friends, who seemed resolute. I made up my mind. The key of defeating Baron was to keep his paralysis out of the question. The battle was holding up for now, thanks to our large numbers and high average level, but it was the same party that had tackled him in the beta. We'd been wiped out by now. "All right, just for a bit. I'll be right back." Before I left, I unleashed a vertical arc into NATO's back as he stood frozen after missing a big attack, and I sped off to my target. I shot across to the Coliseum-style chamber, and more than 100 yards across, headed back to the main battle in the back. My pasty, skinny, real body back home would be lucky to break 14 seconds in a 100-meter dash, but the agile, heavy Kirito crossed the space in 10 flat. My boot heels screeched to a halt as I lined up next to the blue cape at the rear. For a moment, it occurred to me that this was the first time I'd ever been face-to-face with Lind, the leader of this raid and former confidant of Diovel the Knight. 10 days earlier, just after we had defeated the previous boss, he'd screamed, "Why did you abandon Diovel to die? You knew the moves the boss was using. If you'd have told us that information to start with, Diovel wouldn't have died." I hadn't apologized. I'd met him with a cold smile. "I'm a beater. Don't you ever insult my skill by calling me a former tester." And having said my piece, I put on the coat of midnight I was still wearing and left the first floor boss chamber. I haven't interacted with Lin since that very moment. So it shouldn't have been a surprise that when I sidled up next to him, Lin's first reaction was to grimace of disgust. His narrow eye went wide, his blade's sharp chin tremored, and his thin lip went even thinner. But that manifestation of his true emotion soon sank back beneath his skin. It bothered me that both he and Kabao were attempting to mask their true feelings about me, though it also wasn't my business to care about it. But now, it was not the time to worry about feelings. I ordered you to handle the sub-boss. Why aren't you? He growled, before I interrupted with the line I'd prepared. Let's regroup. If any more members get paralyzed, it's going to make escape nearly impossible. The raid leader looked back at the 7 or 8 players waiting to recover, and then the state of fight itself. Following his lead, I checked the HP bar of General Baron. His 5 bars, they lowered to the first third of the halfway point. We'd already halfway done with this boss. We're halfway there. Why would we need to retreat now? I had to admit, there was a part of me that thought it would be a waste to give up it now. In the 10 minutes since then had started the battle, several people had been paralyzed, but no one's HP had fallen into the red zone. And the pace of our damage against the boss was better than expected. There was more than a small chance that we could continue to press on and make it through. But as if seeing through my hesitation, a voice rang out behind us. How about we turn back if one more person gets paralyzed? I turned around to see Kabao's familiar light brown spikes of hair. No doubt he was also filled with a powerful disgust at me for being tried and true beta tester. But the look on his face was honest and forthright. Everyone's got a hang of the numbing range and timing. They're focused and morale is high. We've been pounding paralysis and healing potions, so if we stop now, we might not have the supplies to give it another shot until tomorrow. Again, I let my mind race a half second before reaching a conclusion. The most important thing here was not the number of tries or the sum of spent resources, but human life. We need to succeed without losing anyone. That was the first rule of any boss battle in Aincrad. But Linden Kabao already knew that, and if the leader of the sub-leader of the raid decided that we could still win, the only thing that was the single fighter from outlying party would do by disgracing was sabotage the chain of command. Obviously, it was a bad decision. And on top of that, my own instincts were telling me that we could just maintain our current progress. We could beat Baron without any casualties. All right, one more. Just be careful when we get down to the last HP gauge, I said. Kabao growled in acknowledgement and turned back to his station. Linden Kabao nodded silently and resumed his command. Team E, prepare to retreat. Team G, prepare to advance. Switch to the next stagger. His orders as I turned back and across the Coliseum to rejoin Team H. Asuna wasted no time in asking, What happened? We'll pull back if one more person gets paralyzed. But at our current pace, we can probably make it. I see. She briefly looked upset and glanced over at the main battle, but begrudgingly agreed with decision. All right, in that case, let's finish off this blue guy quick so we can join the others. Yeah! Having reached a rapid consensus, we turned back to see the Colonel NATO that had just unleashed a massive attack that was fully expertly blocked by Agile's group. There was just a bit over 1 full HP bar left. With the perfect precision, we hit the beast with sword skills to either flank. That attack brought NATO to his final HP bar, and the blue-skinned Minotaur bellowed up to the ceiling. He stamped the ground with hooves as big as buckets, and then hunched over to the exposed of his horns, and it tensed to like a coiled spring. It was a new pattern to his fight, but not one I'd never seen before. He's gonna charge. Watch the tail, not the head. He's going along his diagonal. NATO turned his left and charged to his right for Agile, but the axe warrior, poised and prepared, easily dodged out of the way and unloaded his double-handed combo. Whirlwind. He stepped back, and Asuna switched into his continued the onslaught. The damage was so great, spinning yellow rings appeared over the Colonel's head and began to wobble. He'd inflicted our own stun status on him. Now's our chance! Everyone, use 2 full power attacks! Rah! All 6 of us surrounded the Taurus and pummeled him with flashes of red, blue, and green. His HP bar lost refreshingly large chunks in quick succession. Soon plunged into the yellow zone. That signaled less than half remaining. Our full attack a success. We held distance once more and led the Taurus's skin turned purple as he raged even louder. This berserk state before he died was again the same as in the beta. His attack speed was half again, as fast as before, but with a calm head, this was not an issue. On the other side of the chamber, the player let out a roar. I nearly lost my balance for a moment before I realized it was a cry of high spirits. General Baron's final HP bar had gone to yellow as well. Meanwhile, the number of paralyzed targets along the wall had not risen, but had shrunk to 5. It's a good thing there weren't any surprises since the beta, Asuna opined to me while we waited for our skills cool down behind Agile's protective wall. I looked back at the battle at hand and nodded. Yeah, but if we'd been paying attention against the Kobold Lord, we'd have noticed that the weapon on his back was a katana, not a talwar. And General Baron hasn't changed an inch since the beta, so I suddenly realized that the shadow had passed across Asuna's face. What's wrong? Nothing. I'm just overthinking things. I was just noticing that weird first floor boss was a lord, but the second one was only a gong. A sudden crash interrupted our conversation as we turned as one a source of the sound, the center of the Colosseum chamber. But there was nothing there, only a series of concentric floor rings made by one of the blackish stone. No, it was moving. The 3 circles of paving stones were sliding, rotating, and counterclockwise, and slowly picking up speed. The stones were rising from the floor before our eyes, elevating into 3-step stage onto the center of the room. Suddenly, the view of the far wall over the center platform began to waver. Uh-oh, I grunted. That was a visual effect that had signaled a very large object being generated into the map. As I feared, the thick wavering in the air rapidly spread and began to generate a thick, menacing shadow at the center. The shadow soon coalesced into a humanoid form that grew into 2 legs, thick as tree trunks, and thudded heavily onto the stage. Sturdy, dark chainmail covered the figure's waist, but its torso was as usually bare. This one had a long, twisted beard that hung down to its stomach. The head was that of a bull, but it had 6 horns instead of 2, and atop of the center of its head was a round accessory of silvery platinum, a crown. The mammoth figure, so black it might as well have been painted with ink, reared back, and the third of the largest of the torsos let out a roar. Flashes of lightning spread around the Minotaur, filling the chamber with a blinding light. Finally, a 6-party HP bar had appeared, so high in my field of view that it seemed to be stuck to the ceiling. I gazed dully at the letters that appeared. Asteroids, the Taurus King. Keep your mind moving. Think, I told myself, so hard that if I wasn't gritting my teeth, I'd spoken the words aloud. It was clear what had just happened. General Baron, whom every player present, including me, assumed was the second floor boss, was just as much an opening act as Colonel NATO. Baron's final HP bar turning yellow must have been the trigger to generate the true boss, the pitch-black King Astrois. But speculation about the origin of the creature was pointless. What mattered was what we did next. There was no need to think. We had to retreat out of the chamber. We didn't even know how this monster would attack, and the risks of fighting this Taurus King were clearly far greater than that of the general. The problem was that Astrois had spawned in the corner of the chamber, and the raid party was fighting in the back of the room. The group would need to charge through the attack range in order to reach the exit. Team H, fighting Colonel NATO, was the closest to the exit. We could probably make it out safely now if we broke for it, but if we did that, teams A through G wiped out by the king. Our chances of beating this game of death disappeared along with them. How to evaluate a 47-man raid? The first step was eliminating our present foes as quickly as possible. Time seemed to spring back into motion once our path became clear. I promptly raised my sword high and shouted, "All units, attack all out!" My eyes away from Astrois atop his 3 steps and fixed a gauge on the berserk Colonel NATO. I leapt as hard as I could, following the path of his hammer as he raised it behind him. As a speed-focused swordsman with no heavy metal or armor, I could jump about 6 feet from standing position. Nato was closer to 7 or 8 feet, but with the added reach of my sword, I could easily get to his head. My slant skill hit the shining black horns directly. Nato's attack motion stopped part way, and reared back and roared. The Tauruses of the second floor labyrinth, except for a few, say the Taurus Iron Guard, which wore a heavy metal helm, were weak to my blows to the horn. So I hadn't tried to strike the foreheads at any point until now, because jumping attacks were inherently risky, and even a clean hit from the sword was no guarantee that the opponent would suffer a movement delay. But this situation called for desperate measures. At the exact moment I landed, Asuna and Agil's team followed up with attacks of their own, knocking Nato's HP into the red zone. His delay wore off, and the Minotaur roared up and began his motion for a numbing skill. In other case, now was the time to pull back and push forward. Rah! With a roar of my own, I unleashed my very best horizontal. Even if I hit the beast's weak point, I couldn't stagger the creature on consecutive attacks. But it wasn't the forehead I was aiming for. It was Nato's giant hammer. The timing window was extremely short, but if I hit his sword skill with one of my own just before he fired it off, it was possible to cancel the attacks all out. There was a piercing clang that seemed to strike directly into the center of my brain, and my sword shot backwards. Meanwhile, the hammer was pushed back overhead. Without missing a chance, my 5 companions proceeding to launch another wave of attacks. Only a few pixels of HP remained. Under normal circumstances, chaining sword skills together was impossible. But I knew from our hunting of the wind wasps the other day that you could get past that limitation if you use weapons of different categories. I curled up in midair and kicked out with my left foot. The resulting crescent moon, a vertical kick attack as I spun backwards, caught Nato right on the forehead. The Taurus hurtled back and let out a high-pitched screech before freezing stiff, then exploding into a massive cloud of polygons. It must have been treated as a proper sub-boss, not just a typical boss, because I promptly saw last attack bonus read out. I didn't have time for that, however. I spun around as I hit the ground. The first thing I saw across the room was a towering, ebony back. King Astrois was on the move. Fortunately, he hadn't targeted any of the 5 paralyzed along the east wall, but his destination was about 36 remaining fighters of the main party, who were still busy with General Baron. My worst fear was the main force would fall into total panic and chaos, and retreat if faced by a boss on either side. Fortunately, that was not happening, but very soon his lumbering steps would take him within attack range of the raid. We had to defeat the general before then. "Let's go, Kirito," said Asuna, her voice tense. But I wasn't sure if I should agree. It wasn't that I was afraid of my own life. For some reason that I couldn't explain, I was gripped with the sudden feeling that once I set foot into battle ahead, I could not guarantee she'd survive. But I knew damn well how good Asuna was. I wasn't even sure if I could beat her one-on-one duel. But there was no denying my urge to force her to escape right then and there. After I had abandoned my first and my only friend at the start of this game, and was nearly killed by a fellow beta tester just hours later, I had sworn to live as a solo player, relying on no one but myself. The week that I had just spent as a partnership of sorts was only a means of uncovering and stopping Nezha's fraud, nothing more. So why was I being ruled by this emotion? This sentimentality. Why was I so desperate to keep Asuna from dying? "Asuna, you need to run," I wanted to say, but I saw the powerful light in her hazel eyes. They told me that she knew full well what I was thinking. Her eyes were full of emotion that was neither anger nor sadness, but something even purer. Again, she said, "Let's go." There was enough strength in that voice that it bottled up the fear that had overtaken me. "All right," I said, and looked back to Agil's party. The axe warrior nodded to me, not frightened in the least. "We'll swing around the right flank and defeat Barons first. If the king attacks before then, we've got to pull him away the best we can to buy them time." Got it! The others shouted. Bolstered by their courage, I leapt forward. By the time I reached full speed, my hesitation was gone. The monster's reaction zone, also called its aggro range was invisible to the naked eye, but the more experience one built, the more it felt like a tangible thing. I followed my instincts and circled around the right side of the plotting King Astrois, waiting for the main party. Baron's HP bar was already down to the red zone, but, as with NATO, when he was nearly dead, Baron had gone into a berserk state and was using numbing denotation at every possible chance, slowing the group's attack progress. We had 30 seconds until the Kings started to attack. I gauged and I darted right between the wide-eyed Lind and Cabao, directly in front of General Baron, leaping and aiming for his blazing orange horns. But the general was nearly twice the size of the colonel. Even my highest jump combined with the longest reach couldn't make it all the way. Grah! At the apex of my jump, I took pains to hold my stance and just barely managed to throw off the sword skill. My anneal blade glowed green, and my body sped back into motion as though my invisible hands, sonic leap, and a one-handed sword skill. This desperate attack hit him right between his weak points, and the general's body arced backwards. This staggering was our final chance. Asuna and the other four didn't need my order to know what to do. They raced into land blows and then pulled back. The rest of the raid followed their lead. General Baron was enveloped in flashing effects of every color. But, once again, it wasn't quite enough. There was still a pixel or two left of his HP bar. Not again! I cursed, clenching my left fist. Coming out of a major sword skill off balance, my only option was a simple attack. I roared and swung forward with my flash blow, hitting him square in the chest. It was just enough to damage to do the job, and that tiny little jab sent the massive body expanding and exploding. I landed hard, ignoring the LA bonus to read out entirely, and took a deep breath to command everyone to retreat back against the wall. There was no time to worry about whether it was overstepping my bounds or not. But my breath caught my throat before I could speak. The Onyx Taurus King, who should have been still 10 seconds away, was leaning backwards, his massive chest bulging out like a barrel. That looked like a breath attack, long range. Right in his path, back to him, her eyes fixed in a straight at me, was Asuna. If she didn't move now, there would be no escape. I couldn't waste time racing over to her, but that kind of logical reasoning went out of the window. Asuna, jump to your right! I shouted as I dashed towards her. There was no other players in breath range, of course, but my tunnel vision was fixed on no one but the hooded fencer. She must have sensed the danger approaching from behind in my voice and expression. She leapt out as I commanded, not bothering to turn around. As soon as her boots left the black paving ground, I reached her and slipped my left arm around her slender body, leaping into the same direction to add it to our motion. Even at our full strength, the jump speed was unbearably slow. The abstract pattern in the floor followed past glacial pace. The right side of my vision went pure white. The dry shockwave that hit me was exactly like the clap of thunder. Astrois, the Taurus King's breath attack, was not poisonous or fire, but lightning. And by the time we realized it, the both of us and over 20 of the other players in the raid were enveloped in its white blaze. There was no such thing as attack, healing, or support magic in Sword Art Online, but that didn't mean that all traces of magic were absent from the game world. There were infinite variety of magical items to be found and raised stats to provide buff effects. And blessings of the town NPC priest and churches were one of the bigger towns granted a player's weapon a temporary holy effect. But those supernatural effects did not exist solely for our benefit. In fact, the majority were detriment. For example, the many special attack skills employed by Monster, Poison, Fire, Ice, and Lightning Breath. The most powerful breath attack in terms of damage was Fire, but Lightning was no joke. For one, it was instantaneous. It traveled the full length of its range in an instant as it was unleashed. Worse, it had a very high chance of stunning its victims, with a worst-case scenario involving even more dangerous debuff. Both Asuna and I took Astrois Lightning Breath to our legs, and we both lost close to 20% of our health in one go. A screen border began to blink. The gauge and debuff icon was the same color as appeared as well. Instantly, I felt my physical senses growing distant. I couldn't move my legs to land upright, and I even tried. Asuna and I slammed into the ground on our backs. There was no mere tumble effect after all, but the warnings were now paralyzed. Asuna! I grasped. She laid across my chest like an immobile plank. Heal with potion! I tried to desperately move my stiff hand. There were 2 red HP potions, 1 green paralysis antidote in my belt pouch on my right side. Somehow, I felt around and grabbed 1 green one and popped the cork and held it up to my lips, even as rumbling footsteps grew closer. Once I finished my minty liquid, I hesitantly looked up to see the massive Taurus King was barely 10 yards away. His attack had hit several other players with paralysis. Over a dozen of them littered the ground between us and him. The other 30 players who escaped the lightning breath were making their way around slowly moving boss, but they weren't sure how to react. The reason why was clear. The raid leader and sub-leader, Linden Gabao, were both paralyzed, and the closest to the boss position. They were desperately trying to give orders, but a whisper was the best anyone suffered from paralysis could produce. None of the players outside Asteroid's attack range could hear them. But very close to my ears came a sound of a fragile, beautiful voice. Why did you come? I looked back to see 2 very large hazel eyes in front of my face. Asuna was collapsed, directly on top of me. Empty potion bottle clutched in her hand. She repeated herself. Why? She was asking me why I'd run over to her. When I realized the Taurus's breath attack was coming, rather than darting directly out of harm's way, I wondered what the answer myself was, but it had not become apparent. All I could say was, I don't know. And for some reason, that there was once again a mystery to me. She smiled gently, closed her eyes, and let her hooded head against my shoulder. I looked over to Asuna's back to see Astrois raising his massive hammer high overhead. The crushing implement, twice as large as even Baron's, was aimed right at Linden Gabao. So this is it, I told myself. If our 2 leaders died, the rest of the raid would flee out of the boss chamber, leaving behind the 10 or so paralyzed, including me and Asuna, to die. But at some point, later in time, they'd be able to use the information gleaned from Asterois, appearance, and attack to launch a second attempt. The worst regret of all this was that I wasn't able to save Asuna and her limitless potential. As I told her after the first floor boss, she could have one day led an enormous guild and been a leader to the player's population, like a shooting star, endlessly lighting up the sky of its dark, hopelessly in the game of death. I hallucinated a strange light passing across the ceiling of the dim chamber. But even after opening my eyes wider, the shining arc did not disappear. It reached at an apex and began to fall, heading right towards the crown of Astrois, Barao, and he was preparing to swing his hammer. It wasn't until a high-pitched squeal of metal rang through the Colosseum, and Astrois lurched in pain as I realized the light wasn't a trick of the eye. That was a long-ranged attack that shouldn't have been possible at this point in SAO, a sword skill under the throwing knife category. But the throwing weapon didn't simply fall to the ground after hitting the boss's weak point. It spun around and flew back across the room, as though pulled by an invisible string. Astrois recovered from his delay and roared in anger, making a slow turn back to his attacker. There was a first attack actual hit on the boss, so it automatically drew the enemy's attention. Suddenly, a powerful set of arms pulled me and Asuna off the floor. The mighty warrior, holding 2 people aloft without any help, spoke in a deep baritone. Sorry about that. I actually got a little spooked. Agile the Axe Warrior carried us over to the eastern wall. His 3 companions were also busy moving paralyzed party members to a safer position. As if I brought to their senses, the remainders of the blue and green teams raced over to the other immobilized fighters. I tried to crane my neck up so I could see as he ferried us under his arms, like suitcases. As we moved, the southern side of the wall of the Colosseum came into view behind the boss's massive bulk. About 30 feet from the entrance, a small figure clutching a bizarre weapon was staring up at the looming giant with a resolute look on his face. Is that? Agile cried in a surprise as he dropped us on the floor against the wall. And it wasn't just him. Virtually everyone in the chamber was staring with shock as a new 48th player, Not because he had suddenly appeared just before the boss routed us, or because he used a strange unfamiliar weapon. It was because we had all seen this man hammering away at an anvil in the eastern plaza of Tehran just a few days ago. It was Nezha, the blacksmith. He was dressed much differently now, of course. The brown leather apron was replaced by a bronze chest plate, gauntlets of the same material, and an open-faced helmet. But the image of the beardless dwarf that his short, stocky build and round, dour face created hadn't been neutralized by this new look. If anything, his outfit accentuated it. The entire raid had shocked that a blacksmith would be here participating in the boss's raid, with only two exceptions. Asuna and me, the ones who'd convinced him to change careers in the first place. I was surprised as well, of course, but only because I hadn't expected him to be able to charge straight through the labyrinth alone after just 3 days of training. But there were others here who'd just been as shocked as much different way from the rest of us. As soon as the thought occurred to me, a group rushed forward from the raid party in the center room. They came to stop once they reached the angle that gave them a clear view of Nezha's face around the side of the boss. It was Team G, the Legend Braves. Nez! Orlando started to call the name of his missing partner, but he was held back by the last incident. It seemed the Braves were still trying to hide the fact that Nezha was part of the guild. For an instant, Nezha looked back at his silent former companions with a look of pain. But he composed himself and yelled,
"I'll draw the boss away! Get everyone back to their feet now, while you can!"
Astroy's walking speed, for the first of his many HP bars at least, was quite slow. If Nezha used 100-yard effectively, he could probably continue to occupy the enemy's attention all by himself. If he held out until all the paralyzed had recovered, we might as well be able to evacuate the entire raid group safely. But no, it wouldn't work. The boss moved slowly, yes, but he had the instantaneous lightning breath to make up for it. There was no way to dodge that onslaught on your very first encounter with it. And based on the moment Nezha had appeared, he probably hadn't seen Astroy's first attack.
Agile, warn him about
the breath attack, I wanted to say, but it was already too late. Astroy stopped, pulled back his head again, sucking in a breath. His chest puffed into a round ball, and little sparks crackled out of his nostrils. Nezha, standing still, looking up at the boss's head. "Move," I rasped. "Get out of the way!" someone in the raid shouted, but Nezha nimbly leaped aside before the words were even out of his mouth. The next instant, a brilliant cone of white lightning shot from the boss's gaping mouth. The breath attack reached nearly the exit room, but Nezha was clear of its path by a good 6 feet. The way he moved. Did he know exactly when to dodge? My eyes went wide, and I suddenly heard a very familiar voice, but not one I would expect to hear. Here, of all places.
"The boss's eyes glowed just before the breath attack."
I looked up from the floor, stunned to see that the tile pattern on the wall warped out of place. An even smaller figure than Nezha appeared out of thin air. My mouth fell open, as did Asuna's and Agile's, if I had to guess, as I stared at that familiar whiskered face, Argo the rat, the information dealer. It was only afterward that I had learned she'd undertaken a series of quests beginning the jungle outside the labyrinth that eventually earned her the information on Astroy's the Taurus King, the true boss of this floor. She had learned it, not just his attack patterns, but the best way to counteract him, such as staggering him as a thrown weapon to the crown atop of his head. When Argo discovered that, she zipped around, turning in objectives, and only finished just after the raid party had entered the labyrinth. Messages couldn't reach anyone in the dungeon, and it was a question whether Argo and her agility-heavy build could make it through the labyrinth alone. As she wavered with indecision outside the tower, she happened across Nezha, who was also preparing to brave the danger of the labyrinth alone. They worked together, using Argo's hiding skill and Nezha's throwing weapons to lure out mobs out of their way, and reached the boss's chamber just before Astroy's appeared and threw the battle into chaos.
"Why are you still lying around? You're not paralyzed anymore,"
Argo said. I finally noticed that the paralysis icon beneath my HP bar was gone. I sprang to my feet and sprinted over to the anneal blade where I lay after I was hit by the breath attack. Asuna's wind flurret was also nearby. So I brought them both back to the wall. I considered whether not to address what Asuna said while we were on the ground, and then decided it was the right moment. A quick look around told me that everyone else had recovered from their paralysis. Lind and Cabal were on their feet, but I saw Argo marching over to them. For an instant, I even forgot that Nezha was single-handedly keeping the boss occupied. Argo, the rat, was along with me, one of the most prominent public-known beta testers in the game, and Len Cabals were the leaders of the anti-tester movement. As I expected, Len didn't even pretend to hide his disgust, while Cabal's expression was most uneasy and uncertain. "Hey, Spiky, long time no see," Argo greeted Cabal, ignoring Lind entirely. That was when it hit me. Cabal was the very man who attempted to buy my anneal blade through Argo. It was kind of shady dealing that no leader would want to be associated with him, and Argo could sell the leader details to anyone who paid for the price. He didn't respond to her greetings, so she continued. "If you're gonna pull out, you better do it now, but if you want info, I can sell it to you for the low price of nothing." The moment Astro's lightning breath hit Lind and Cabal, they were the greatest risk of dying of anyone in the raid. So it was a bit of a surprise to me that just after a few seconds of deliberation, they chose to continue the fight. Of course, we wouldn't know if that was the right choice or not until the end of the fight. But the tables had turned, significantly since the moment just after the boss appeared. Nezha had successfully pulled Astro's aggro for over 2 minutes, giving the rest of the raid enough time to recover from paralysis and refill their HP. On top of that, now we had the details on the boss's patterns. "All right, let's begin the attack. Teams A and D forward," Lind ordered. The heavily armored tanks rushed in at King Astrois. Their body blow charge hit him in the legs, finally drawing his attention away from Nezha. Instantly, he stopped, and his expression was weak as usual, but with a new core of strength behind his smile, he held up the throwing weapon in his right hand. It was the weapon I'd given him, a thick-bladed circular throwing tool about 8 inches across. The only way to get it at this point was a rare drop from the Taurus ring hurler, enemies in this labyrinth. It fell under the chakram subcategory of throwing knives, but unlike the actual chakram from ancient India, this one had a leather grip alongside the circle. The grip made it useful for both throwing like a disc or augmenting punch like a set of brass knuckles. Because of the versatility of chakrams, an SAO couldn't be used with the throwing knife skill alone. They also required the mastery of martial arts, the extra skill that could only be learned from the bearded master hidden deep in the mountains. As he said himself 3 days ago, he could hit monsters with a thrown weapon without having to worry about too much with his perspective issues. But orthodox throwing knives were quantifiable weapons that ran out over time and weren't suited for a main weapon. But the chakram was like a boomerang. It returned to the thrower's hand automatically. Thanks to that, he didn't need to worry about ammunition. Nezha steadied his weary legs and held up his chakram. The blade was glowing yellow. Even though it was one who'd given him the weapon, I didn't know the name of his sword skill. "Yeah!" With a powerful cry, his hand flashed, and sparkling ring flew high into the air. It raced across the ceiling, a brilliant burst of light, and hit Astrois on the crown with a perfect accuracy as he raised his giant hammer. There was another high-pitched clang, and the boss's torso writhed. One of the attackers in Cabal's team shouted, "Nice!" from the Taurus's king's feet. The chakram hurtled back with an alarming speed and smacked right back into Nezha's hand. Thanks to the assistance of the game engine, he turned to me and Asuna and smiled again, as though he were about to burst into tears. "It's like a dream come true. Here I am, in the boss's battle, playing a role." His voice quavered and died out there. Nezha swallowed and tried again. "I'll be fine. Go ahead and join the battle." "All right. Do your best and read his lightning breath ahead of time and stagger him before he uses it. You're our key to our victory." I turned around and saw not just Asuna, but Agile and his band of hardy companions, ready for action. Wasn't Agile supposed to be the leader of his team? I'll have to apologize to him for later taking him over. I shouted an order to the group. Let's go! They echoed my call, and we headed to the unceasing series of sword flashes centered around our foe. The true boss of the second floor of Aincrad, Astrois the Taurus King, was third bigger than even Baron and General Taurus. His paralyzing lightning breath had terrified us momentarily, but with Argo's knowledge of his pattern, the group had devised a safe and steady strategy that was chipping away at his health. The greatest role of the battle was undoubtedly Nezha, his throwing weapon. But it soon became clear that the single strongest group was Team G, not Linda Cabao's forces, but the Legend Braves. Like General Baron, Astrois used an area effect skill, numbing denotation. But Orlando and his team were able to take the numbing effects at very close range without ever being stunned. When the king lifted his mighty hammer, the other groups had evacuated to safety, but Team G stayed right on him, continuing their assault without fear of his detrimental attacks. Even Lind had no idea when to give the order for them to retreat. All the Braves had high debuff resistance, thanks to their heavily upgraded gear. The unfortunate truth was that they'd earned the money for that Herculean task through Nezha upgrading scam. But now Nezha was no longer a blacksmith. There was no longer any chance they'd take the heat for it. It's a complicated feeling, isn't it? Asuna mumbled when we retreated temporarily to drink healing potions. Yeah, but at least they shouldn't be able to do it anymore. I replied, referring to the weapon-switching fraud. If they're able to help us advance through the game like this, we'll just have to accept it. I still feel bad for those who lost their weapons, though. Yeah. She still looked conflicted, so I took her mind off things by leaning in close and sharing an idea. You know, I don't really feel like letting them win Battle MVP, so how about we fight back a little bit? If the timing permits it, of course. Fight back? I lifted the edge of her hood and whispered into her ear. Asuna's eyes looked skeptical, exasperated, but she nodded in agreement. When she pulled the hold back over her head, I thought and detected a hint of a smile on her lips, but I couldn't peer in close for a second look. Hey, Kirito! Agile rumbled from behind, with an odd note to his voice, and emptied a bottle in his hand. You said you weren't a pair, right? Asuna straightened up and pivoted her heel. Her voice was frosty. We are not. Fortunately, we did not need to weigh in on the topic, because a cheer broke out from the direction of the battle. Astrois' last HP bar had gone red. Our team's HP bar had just hit its maximum again, which was perfect timing. Team E, pull back. Team H, up forward, Lind commanded. I held up my free hand and clenched my anneal blade, +6. Even if it was our turn in the rotation, it spoke to Lind's fairness as a leader that he didn't try to hold me back. Okay, hang on, I said, waiting for the right timing. Go! We darted in to take the place of a green Team E along the boss's left flank. First, Asa and I traded off with a single skill against the tree trunk legs. The monster roared in rage and swiped at us. Agile and his friends blocked as they switched in. Astrois' size was certainly frightening, but on the other hand, the larger a monster was, the more people could attack it at once. One full party was all that could fight Colonel NATO at a time, while 2 could tackle General Baron, and King Astrois was large enough for 3 at once. Team H took the left side, Blue Team B handled him from the front, and Center Orlando Team G was still tearing away at his right flank. The King Baron's black skin was burning like coal, a sign of his berserk state, but we were on pace to finish him off with this set. With the terrible primal roar, Astrois began to suck in air again. I didn't need to see the sparks around his mouth to know he was preparing his attack. But just as quickly as he started, the chakram flew and struck him in the crown. Lightning exploded harmlessly from the king's nostrils. If this was a normal MMO, that 100% guaranteed stagger from the chakram would have been nerfed to oblivion. I thought to myself, referring to the practice of reducing its power to restore proper game balance. Floor bosses in SAO were one-time affair. Once defeated, they would never return. If Akihiko Kayaba was indeed watching over the battle from afar, would he be gnashing his teeth at the sight of his guardian, unable to stay poised long enough to unleash his best attack? Or would he be applauding the ingenuity and luck of the players who hit upon this unlikely strategy? "We were going to beat your second floor in just 10 days, Kayaba," I thought triumphantly. A glance at the king's HP bar showed just a tiny sliver of red about to disappear. He raged even harder, stomping 3 times in succession before raising his hammer. Team B pulled back, recognizing the numbing denotation motion, while Team G readied their best sword skills. If the Legend Braves seized the last attack bonus here, they'd go from the backup force during the Bulbous Bow fight to the best fighters in the game, but I wasn't charitable enough to sit back and let them reap those rewards. I had a beater reputation to uphold. "Now, Asuna!" I leapt as high as I could. The fencer kept right up with me. In fact, her jumping speed was faster than mine. The force ripped her hood from her head, and the long chestnut brown hair flowed through the air. Vrrrah! Astrois brought down the hammer. A circular shockwave spread from the impact point, followed by circular bursts of sparks. 2 of the Braves couldn't fully resist, succumbing to the stun effect from his final attack. Numbing impact was weaker than denotation, and couldn't be avoided by jumping. So, Asa and I would suffer from the same effects once we touched the ground. But, see ya! Asuna unleashed a fierce cry, and then shot up a rapier charge, a shooting star, in midair. Rah! I followed her with one-handed sword skill charge attack, Sonic Leap. We both shot up vertically, followed by trails of blue and green light. We were headed straight for the forehead of the King Astrois, which was protected by his metal crown. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the flashing of 3 mobile members of the Legend Braves firing off their own sword skills. The next instant, our Needleblade and Windflare pieced the crown entirely and sank deep into the enemy's head. The crown splintered and cracked into pieces. The massive body of King Astrois burst into an explosion that filled the entire Colosseum chamber. 13. "Congratulations!" came a familiar voice, making a familiar statement in English with a familiar native accent. Asa and I turned, exhausted after a long battle, to see Agile smiling again. His meaty hand was curved into a thumbs up, which I returned. Asuna didn't bother with that, but there was a rare smile on her beautiful face. Agile lowered his hand and let his eyes gaze into the distance. "Your skill and teamwork are as brilliant as ever, but this victory doesn't belong to you. It's his." "Yeah, if it wasn't for him, we'd have lost at least 10 people in this fight," I replied. Asuna nodded in agreement. Standing alone on the far side, celebrating mass of players, was a small figure of Nezha, the former blacksmith. He stared up at the ceiling, watching the vanishing fragments of the boss' golden rings clutch in his hand. I was distracted by a sudden cheer that rose up from the group. At the center, Lyndon Cabal looked in a bracing handshake. The blue and green squads were applauding wildly, and I joined in by clapping. "Sheesh. They're best friends after all." "At least until we reach the 3rd floor," Asuna noted sardonically. I got to my feet, whispered thanks to my Needleblade for its duty, and returned it to the sheath. After pulling Asuna up to standing position and sharing a brief fist bump, I finally felt the satisfaction of victory, of winning safe and sound. We'd finished the 2nd floor of Aincrad, and it had taken us 10 days, and there were 0 fatalities in the boss battle. After taking an entire month on the 1st floor, and losing our promising leader Diavelt in the fight, this was better than I could have hoped for. But I reminded myself that we were hair's breadth from being wiped out entirely. The sudden surprising appearance of King Astrois nearly killed Lyndon Cabal, not to mention Asuna and me. We learned 2 lessons from this battle. 1, fulfill every quest around the last town and the labyrinth, because they might impart info on the boss. And 2, we had to assume that every boss from this point on had been changed in some way from the beta test. Of course, we'd only made it to the 9th floor in the beta, so once we reached the 10th, that's all new regardless. Not only did gathering info through the quest become important, but so would scouting out the boss first. The latter would not be easy, however. Most boss monsters didn't appear until you reached the back of the chamber and destroyed some key object, so there was no guarantee that a reconnaissance party would escape safely. There were a fair number of speedy scout types among us, but very few of us could use throwing tools. From this point on, the role of Nezha, the chakram thrower, as well as Argo, would become even more critical. I took a quick look around the room and didn't see the rat, even with my search skill. She must be hiding again. I nudged Asuna and we made our way over to Nezha. When the ex-blacksmith saw us, he smiled radiantly, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Nezha bowed and said,
"Great work, Kirito and Asuna. That last mid-air sword skill was incredible."
Well, actually, I scratched my head uncomfortably. I didn't want to tell him that it was just me trying to make sure I beat Orlando's group to the prize. Instead, Asuna answered for me. "Incredible? That was your appearance. How did you manage to use a brand new weapon with such skill? You must have practiced quite a lot."
"No, it didn't seem hard to me. I mean, I finally got to be what I'd always wanted. Really, thank you so much. Now I have..."
He trailed off and bowed deeply one more time, then turned back to face the center of the room. I followed his gaze and saw a group of 5 about 20 yards away from me from the crowd. They were lined up and exchanging handshakes. Orlando with Lind, Beowulf with Cabal, and 3 others, leading players. They wore proud smiles of true heroes. If you looked at the results screens from the battle against Astrois, the score based on damage defended and caused by the Legend Braves would easily outclass any other team. They'd found their place, front and center among the best players in the game. I didn't know if they'd end up joining Linden Dragon Knights or Cabal's Liberation Squad, or if they'd start their own guild, but... "Nezha, shouldn't you be with them up there?" I asked, but the single most important person in the fight simply shook his head. "No, it's fine. There's something else I still need to do." "Huh? What's that?" I asked. Nezha looked at me, and then at Asuna, whose brows were furrowed in apparent understanding. He bowed once more, then lovingly traced the surface of his chakram blade with a finger and began to walk away. That's when I noticed that 3 players from the raid were coming this way. At first, I assumed they were coming to thank and congratulate Nezha, but their faces were hard. After examining the tall man in the front with the broadsword, I finally realized why. This man, now wearing a breastplate over the blue doublet of Lin's group, was none other than Shivata. The man who'd asked Nezha to upgrade his sword 5 days ago. Next to him was another man in blue, and the third, who wore green on Cabal's team. They were all scowling. Shivata pulled up in front of Nezha and growled, "You're the blacksmith who's been working on Urbis and Tehran just a few days ago, aren't you?"
"Yes,"
Nezha replied. "Why'd you switch to fighter? How'd you get that rare weapon? It's only a drop item, isn't it? Did you make that much money from smithing?" Oh no. Shivata's tone said that he'd already suspected Nezha of a shady dealing. Even if he didn't have a clue about the weapon switching trick, he was clearly guessing that some kind of foul play had occurred. In truth, Nezha's chakram was a rare weapon, but not particularly valuable. After all, it required both throwing knife and martial arts skill to use. But explaining all of that would remove the suspicion from Shivata's mind. Eventually, all the celebrating players fell silent, including Linden Cabal and the Legend Braves, watching this new turn of events. Most had looks of grave concern, but even at a distance, the panic and tension on the faces of the Legend Braves were written plain as day. In the moment, neither I nor Asuna knew what to do. It would be easy to speak up and say that I gave him that chakram, but that was deflecting the brunt of Shivada's anger and forcing him to back down. Really the right choice? It was undeniable truth that Nezha had seized Shivada's precious treasured stout blade and broken a spent weapon in exchange. Shivada used all of his willpower to control himself at that moment. He left without insulting or blaming Nezha. The broadsword he wore now was 2 ranks below the old stout blade. Shivada had done his best to power up in 5 days between then and now, and had managed to survive through this terrible battle. Did we really have the right trick him again, to lead him away from the truth? Nezha sidestepped my indecision entirely. He laid his chakram on the ground and down on his knees, then pressed his hands on the ground and lowered his head.
I deceived you, Shivada, and the 2 others with you. I switched your swords before attempting to upgrade them, replacing them with spent weapons that I broke instead.
The Colosseum was full of a silence even heavier than the one before the battle, ear-piercing and thick. Sword Art Online had an astonishing system of recreating player emotions on their virtual avatars. But if there was one glaring weakness, it was a tendency to exaggerate for effect. I hadn't seen it for myself, but from what others said, it took a very little time for sadness to manifest as tears. A happy feeling translated to a wide smile, and anger was represented by a reddened face and a bulging vein on the forehead. So the fact that Shivada's only response was furrowed brow was a true testament to his self-control. By contrast, the 2 men at his side looked as though they were ready to explode, but they held it in as well. I looked over at Asuna and saw that she was trying to suppress her feelings as well, but her face was visibly paler than usual. I must have looked the same way. Shivada's hoarse voice finally broke the painful silence. "Do you still have the weapons you stole?" Nezha shook his head, hands firmly on the floor.
"No, I already sold them for money," he rasped.
Shivada clenched his eyes shut at the answer, but he knew it was coming. He only grunted, then asked, "Can you pay me back the value?" This time, Nezha had no immediate answer. Asuna and I held out our breath. Far between Shivada, standing at the left edge of the raid, Orlando's group was visibly uncomfortable. In terms of feasibility, the sum of the money that he'd taken from them was far impossible to raise again. Only 10 days had passed since Nezha and the Legend Braves had started their fraud. The market prices for those items couldn't have changed that much, so if they sold off the assets they'd bought back with the money they'd receive, it should turn back into roughly the same amount. But that was where the problem lay. It wasn't just Nezha who had spent the money they'd unfairly earned, but the entire Legend Braves. The brightly gleaming armor covered their bodies, what was their very sum of their money in physical form. In order to pay back their victims in coal, Orlando and his group would have to sell off their equipment. After they'd just played a major role in the boss battle, would they really just give up on the source of their power? And more fundamentally, how did Nezha plan to get out of this situation? As I watched, holding my breath, the short ex-blacksmith answered forehead still scraped against the floor tiles.
"No, I cannot repay you now. I used all of my money on all-you-can-eat meals at expensive restaurants at high-priced inns."
Asuna sucked in a sharp breath. Nezha wasn't trying to weasel his way out of anything. He was going to take responsibility for all of his crimes, and force Shivada and the other ones to focus their anger and hatred solely on him. He was covering for his companions, the ones who had treated him like a nuisance and egged him into committing those acts. The large member of Lin's team to Shivada's right finally snapped. "Why, you filthy!" He raised a clenched fist and stomped his right boot on the ground multiple times. "Do you have any idea what it was like to see your favorite beloved sword smashed to pieces? And you sold it off! Do you have yourself a feast? To stay in deluxe hotels, then use the rest to buy yourself valuable weapons, barge into the boss battle, and fancy yourself a hero!" Cabal's companions on the left shrieked, When I lost my sword, I thought I'd never fight in the front lines again, but my friends donated some funds to me and helped me gather materials. You didn't just betray us, you stabbed everyone fighting to complete this game in the back. And it lit like a fuse. Those shouts caused all other players who'd been silently watching the scene to explode. Traitor! Do you have any idea what you've done? You've caused our place to slow down. Apologizing isn't going to fix anything. Dozens of voices overlapped into a mass of angry noise. Nezha's lonely back shrank as though succumbing to the pressure of all that rage. When the crowd's anger at the beta testers threatened to explode during the planning of the first floor battle, Agile had been the voice of reason, but there was nothing he could do here. He and his companion stood off at a distance, watching pensively. Orlando's group was equally quiet. The 5 of them were whispering each other, but it was inaudible over all the angry bellowing. I couldn't do anything but watch either. There was no magic word that could solve the situation at this point. Now that the truth of Shivada's weapon was open knowledge, the only thing that could mend the wrongdoing was equal sum of coal, or something similarly heavy. Suddenly, I remembered something Nezha had just said minutes before. I finally got to be what I'd always wanted. Really, thank you so much. Now I have nothing left to regret. Those are the final words he said, the ones I couldn't hear. Nezha, you can't mean... I mumbled. One of the 2 people who had the power to bring this scene to a close strode forward, his hand held high, blue hair and blue cape, a shining silver scimitar at his waist. Lind, the leader of the raid. Shivada's trio stepped back to give him the stage, and the furious shouts that filled the chamber gradually died down. When it was at least quiet enough to have a conversation, he spoke. Will you tell us your name? At that point, I realized that Nezha was never really part of the raid party, as classified by the system. It was one thing that Argo, who passed on the info, had split, but Nezha took on a critical role in hitting the boss's weak point. He deserved to be part of the raid, and we'd been one short of the limit anyway. The only team with 5 members was G, the Legend Braves. Something rubbed me wrong about the fact that Orlando hadn't extended the party offer to Nezha, a friend since before the days of SAO. But more important than that was how Lin decided to rule on the situation. It's Nezha, the ex-blacksmith said, still prostrate on the ground. Lind nodded a few times. His features were sharp by the nature, but he looked more nervous now than he did in the midst of the battle. He cleared his throat. I see. Your cursor's still green, Nezha. But that speaks to the severity of your crime. If you'd committed a proper recognized crime and turned orange, it would be possible to return it to green through good karma quests. But no quest will wipe your sins clean now. If you cannot repay what you owe others in the game, we will have to find a different means of punishment. He can't, I thought to myself, teeth gritted. Lin's thin lips grimaced and then opened again. It was not just swords that you stole from Shivada and others. It was a great amount of time they poured into those blades. Therefore, some of the weight lifted off my shoulders. Lin was about to demand Nezha pay back his crimes by contributing to the game's advancements, and most likely regular payment over a long period. It was the same punishment that Diavel would have meted out if it had happened 10 days earlier. However, before Lin could finish, a high-pitched voice drowned him out. No! It wasn't just time he stole! A green-clad member of Kabao's team ran forward. His skinny body shook left and right as he screeched, I know the truth! There are plenty more players he stole from. One of them had to use a cheap store-bought weapon and ended up getting killed by mobs he'd handled just fine before. The vast, masterless chamber fell silent once more. After a few seconds, the blue-clad man next to Shivada spoke again, his voice hoarse. If someone died because of this, then he's not just a swindler anymore. He's a The scrawny green man jabbed a finger forward and said what the other one couldn't. That's right! He is a murderer! A PKer! That was the first time I'd heard the term PK in open since we'd been trapped in the flying castle. It was one of the most well-known terms among all many MMOs out there. It wasn't short for penalty kick, or psychonesis, or anything like that. It stood for player kill, or player killer. The act of killing another player rather than a monster. Unlike most MMORPGs made these days, PKing was possible in SAO. There was absolute safety within any town, thanks to a stringent anti-crime code, but that protection disappeared outside the town limits. The only thing that protected players when they were on their own, equipment, skills, and trusted companions. In the month-long beta test, 1,000 players cooperated and completed the race upward, sometimes erupting into combat where players crossed swords with one another. But PK did not apply to honest duels between two willing combatants. A player killer was someone who set upon unsuspecting adventures into the wilderness or dungeons. A pejorative term slapped onto those who killed for fun and profit. Several times during the beta, I'd been attacked by PKers, but not once since the full game launched. On the very first night, I was nearly killed by another former tester who had formed a party with me via MPK, a monster player kill, using monsters to do his dirty work. But that was a passive means of killing, and done in an attempt to win a quest item to further his own survival. Now that the chaos of the initial starting dash had died down, it was impossible to imagine someone committing a true PK for the purpose of sick pleasure. With the linking of our virtual and physical fates, PKing was out-and-out murder. In a normal MMO, engaging in such behavior was a form of roleplay, but that excuse didn't fly anymore. After all, killing players, in particular players who showed enough willpower to venture into the wilderness and fight for themselves, only prolonged the possibility of our eventual freedom. The day I met Asuna again in Urbis, and we went to the wind wasp hunting together, I said that wearing a burlap sack for a mask would make me look like a PKer. The only reason I made a joke like that was my belief that no one in Aincrad would actually stoop to such a thing. But here we were, and that ugly term was out in the open. The skinny dagger user from Gabao's team kept shrieking, his finger still pointed at Nezha's head.
A few bows and scrapes can't make up for a PK. No amount of apologizing or money is going to bring back the dead. What's your plan? How are you going to make this right? Well?
There was a painful edge to his voice, a screeching, like a point of a knife scraping against metal. With a cold, sobered corner of my mind, I wondered where I'd heard it before. The memory came within an instant. This dagger-wielding man had leveled a similar charge against me right after we beat the first-floor boss.
I know the truth. He's a beta tester,
rang the voice in my ears. I'd shut him up by haughtily demanding that he not lump me in with the other testers, but that trick wouldn't work here. Nezha, tiny back, absorbed all the accusations hurled at it. He clenched his fists atop the stone and spoke, his voice trembling.
I will accept whatever judgment you decide upon.
Another silence. I felt like every person present understood the meaning behind the word judgment. The air in the Colosseum grew even colder and periculater than before. That invisible energy reached a critical point. Everyone's waiting for one person who would break the tension. Eventually, I succumbed, ready to tell everyone to just wait a moment, even though I didn't have any ideas how to follow it up. But it was a half-second too late. One of the dozen raid members who had been inching up to Nezha finally uttered a short burst. Then pay the price. It was just 4 words, a statement that didn't hold any specific meaning on its own, but it was like a pin that burst an overinflated balloon. Suddenly, the chamber was full of a roar of noise. Dozens of players were shouting all at once. Yeah, pay the price! Go apologize for the ones who died! Live by the PK, die by the PK! The cries grew more and more overt until spilling into direct threats. Pay with your life, fraudster! Settle your accounts by dying! You're PKing bastard! Kill him!
Kill the filthy, screaming scum! I couldn't help but feel like the rage on their faces wasn't entirely the anger at his crime. There was a fury and hatred for the game of Sword Art Online that had trapped them here as well. It was 38 days since we'd been locked in this flying fortress. 98 floors remained to conquer. The overwhelming, desperate pressure of those astronomical odds had finally found an outlet, a target ripe for punishment, a swindler and murderer amongst our ranks. Neither Lind nor Cabal had the means to resolve the situation. Even I'd just been sitting on my heels the entire time, watching the scene unfold. Since Nezha had admitted to his crimes, my eyes wandered until they happened to cross the 5 legend braves, standing at the side of the raid. They weren't shouting like the others, but staring down at the ground, avoiding looking at Nezha. You should have known this would happen one day, Orlando. Didn't you ever see it coming? I asked silently, but there was no answer. In fact, if I was making accusations, the same went for the man in the black poncho who had taught them the trick. If he was generous enough to show them the fancy trick for free, why didn't he explain the potential dangers to them? Unless... What if this situation, the group turning on Nezha, demanding his execution, was exactly what the black poncho was hoping for in return? In that case, what he wanted was not help from the Braves, but the opposite. He wanted Nezha to be killed, at the express desire of all the top players in the game for his direct role in the scam. That would create a precedent for direct player-on-player killing and lower the mental hurdle to reach the act of murder across Aincrad. And my fears were correct. That man in the black poncho was the real PKer here, but rather than soil his own hands with the act, he set up other players to do the dirty work for him, dragging them down to his level. This was bad. We couldn't allow this devious plan to work. We couldn't have Nezha publicly executed. After all, I was the one who recommended that Nezha switch to a combat role and make up for his crime by helping advance the game. In effect, I brought him here to this situation. I had responsibility to prevent his death. Amidst the hails of jeers, someone had finally moved into action. Not Lind, not Cabal, not even Nezha, but the Legend Braves. They slowly crossed the vast room, metal armor clanking toward the prostrate Nezha. Orlando's bassinet visor was half down, so I couldn't see his face. The other 4 marched in step with him, their faces downcast. The semicircle of Lind, the dagger user, Shivada, sensed that something was happening, and they stepped back to make room for newcomers. The group came to a halt with heavy footsteps. Nezha must have sensed the approach of his former comrades, but he did not look up. His fists were still balled on the floor, his forehead pressed to the tile. Orlando stopped directly across from Nezha, the chakram placed on the floor in between. His right hand moved from his left side. Asuna gasped. His gauntlet hand gripped the hilt of his sword and pulled. Orlando's weapon was like mine, an anneal blade. It appeared to be powered up by similar level. If he was going to strike Nezha unprotected back, it'd only take 3 or 4 hits to finish the job. Orlando. I called out the name of the paladin who had just helped defeat the boss monster minutes ago. You spent far more time with Nezha than I ever did, but I can't stand here and watch you kill him, no matter what that does to my reputation. I put all my weight into my right foot, preparing to dart forward the instant he raised his blade. At the same time, I sense Asuna shifting position as well. Don't do anything, Asuna. No, she said flatly. Don't you get it? If you interfere with this, you won't be able to be allowed with amongst the group anymore. You might even be labeled as a criminal. I still won't stop. Don't you remember what I said the first time we met? I left the town at the beginning so I could be myself. I didn't have any time for arguments with which to convince her. Instead, I merely sighed with resignation and nodded. Somehow, the angry shouting that filled the Coliseum had turned to silence again. Everyone watched wide-eyed, waiting with bated breath for the fateful moment. And perhaps, because I was concentrating so hard, I picked out the quiet voice from Orlando's helmet, even though I was nowhere near close enough to hear it. I'm sorry, Nezu. The paladin laid down his sword next to the chakram on the floor. He took a few steps and got down on his knees next to Nezha, facing the same direction, removed his helmet, and put his hands flat on the tile. Beowulf, Kunkulian, Gilgamesh, and Enkidu followed his lead, setting down their weapons and helmets, getting into a line with Nezha at the center. Amidst the dead silence, the six legend braves bowed in apology to the rest of the raid. Eventually, Orlando spoke up, his trembling voice the only sound in the Colosseum. Nezha is our partner. We are the ones who forced him to commit that fraud.
14. Why do we have to be the errand runners here? Asuna grumbled as she trudged along. I shrugged and answered, What can you do? It's just the way it is. No, not that. We were a party of 2 during the first boss fight, but this time we had a full 6. Only because Agile was considerate enough to let us join him. We'll need to thank him when this all blows over. Asuna raised an eyebrow at me. What? Nothing. I'm just wondering if your skill at getting along is earning a few proficiency points. That's my line, I wanted to say, but I held it in. That should be clear since I have a gift from him, too. Oh, what's that? The mighty straps you found in the labyrinth? Oh, good idea. I'll have to give him those, too. I patted my fist onto my palm. Asuna looked at me doubtfully. Then her eyes went wide with understanding. Oh, I know. You're going to foist that thing you've been keeping in the inn chest off on Agile. Indeed. She was referring to the large vendor's carpet that Nezha left with me when he abandoned his blacksmithing skill and went off to learn the martial arts skill. It was an expensive and useful item, but offered little benefit to combat-focused character. Plus, it couldn't be placed in one's inventory, so had to be rolled up and hoisted around by hand. Agile might be a warrior, but he seems likely to know some promising future blacksmiths. Wouldn't you suspect? I'm sure Nezha would be happy knowing that it went to good use. But what if Agile himself wakes up to the lures of running his own business? Then I'll be his first customer, I answered glibly. Asuna sighed and glanced ahead. We were walking up a spiral staircase between the 2nd and 3rd floor, but for some unknown design purpose, the stairs spiraled around the entire 800-foot wide tower, meaning we actually had to walk the 2,500 feet, plus height. But because there was no monsters on the staircase, it was still a much easier exit from the tower than going from the boss chamber all the way down to the front entrance. As the roving strikers, or if you prefer, leftovers, of the raid, Asa and I had been given our orders by Lind to leave the labyrinth, which was shut off from all instant messages, and deliver the news of our victory to all the players who were eagerly waiting on an update. Normally, this would be the job, no privilege, of Lind or Cabal, but the main raid force could not leave the boss chamber for another hour or so. Not because they were locked inside, but because they were busy talking. The debate raged on about how to deal with Nezha and the Legend Braves, but I no longer had any concern about the outcome of that discussion. The instant Orlando and his partners had laid down their weapons and admitted their sins, the conclusion was foretold. No matter how heated the group was, they weren't so bloodthirsty that they would execute a group of 6 players, and the addition of the Braves to the guilty side changed the equations. Now Shivada and the others could realistically be repaid their lost weapons. Orlando explained every last detail of the deception and removed all of his equipment, not just the sword and helm. The other 4 followed his lead and produced a small mountain of high-level gear that would fetch a price beyond my estimation. He told the group that if they turned all these items into cash, it would surpass the value of the lost weapons. They'd sunk their own honestly earned money into the armor as well, and served as a repayment for all the victims of their scheme. If there was coal left over, it could be used as a potion fund for the next boss battle. Now that the damages were able to be repaid, the remaining problem was a player who had died because his weapon was stolen. Under the current configuration of SAO, no amount of money could make up for a lost life. The legend braves offered to find the fellow's companions and apologize in person, if that would help in any way. When they asked the dagger user who brought the story up, he backed down on his assertion, saying it was just a rumor, and he didn't know the name. In the end, the group decided to ask the information agent to discover the truth of the matter. The first controversy over players swindling an Aincrad was about to reach a close, without bloodshed. But there was one problem remaining. How to convert the dozens of pieces of high-powered equipment into cash. There was always the option of selling to NPC merchants in town, but the NPC prices were always kept below the market rate by invisible hand of the system in order to combat inflation. If we were going to get the maximum value, the transactions had to be with other players. The people with the most coal and the largest need for good equipment were the frontline players, so Lind and Cabal considered the possibility of selling the equipment to a few dozen players present at the boss chamber and donating the money to the Shivada's group of 3. Of course, there were more victims to the scheme than just the people present here, so proper payment would need to be made once everyone went back to town. So the delay in leaving the boss chamber was due to a spontaneous auction. Sadly, none of the items was suitable for agile leather wearers like me and Asuna, and even if there were some, I wouldn't have been in the mood to buy and equip them. As we stood around feeling relieved that peaceful solution was found, Lynn came over and said, "If you don't have anything better to do, could leave the dungeon and tell the newspapers that our conquest was successful." I couldn't find a good reason to decline his request, so I prodded the reluctant Asuna, and we went out the door to the back of the chamber to the next floor. Agile and his friends waved a goodbye, but we didn't have an opportunity to say anything to Nezha, the former blacksmith. As soon as Orlando and his friends lined up around him, his little back trembled and shook with a constant sob. "Well, it seems like the case of fraud is going to wrap up safely. What do you suppose Nezha and the Braves are going to do next?" Asuna wondered, as she climbed the gentle sloping staircase. I mulled it over. Depends on them. They can't prevent the tale of the Braves' shady behavior from spreading around the line. Either they'll have to avoid everyone here and go back to the town of beginnings, or start over from scratch and try to reach our level again. Before we left, Lynn told me that if they wanted to, he'd allow them to keep a minimum coal necessary for equipment they'll need to hang around. No matter what they choose, they won't treat Nezha like a third wheel. To be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about Orlando. But if they do make it back to the front line, I'll do my best to work with them. I mean, even you did all right with Lind and Cabal, didn't you? I nearly missed a step. I haven't changed my attitude a bit. If anything, they're the ones who are acting weird. Cabal totally anti-tester, and Lynn trying to raise an elite fighting force, so solos like me are the only obstacles in his goals. And yet, both of them were being oddly normal. Asuna momentarily looked frosty when I uttered the word solo. She sighed and said, "As usual, you're completely clueless." Huh? How so? If all the former Frontier players were under the lead of either Lind or Cabal alone, they would have been much more open about excluding you. But the Blue Dragon Knights and the Green Aincrad Liberation Squad are jockeying for power even as they work together, right? Yeah. In the current situation, they're both on edge. They think that if they antagonize you too much, you'll end up aligning with the other team. Me. With either blue or green. I came to a standstill and even chuckled. No way. They'd shut the door on my face, even if I had actually wanted to join. I'm an evil beater, right? I mean, even today, I shut my mouth and started hopping up the steps. Asuna hurried in to catch up, looking skeptical, then raised a finger in sudden understanding. Hey, by the way, what happened to the boss's last attack bonus? On Asteroids, the Taurus King, I mean. I didn't get a prompt. And now that I think about it, didn't you win the LA on the Colonel NATO and General Baron? You didn't get the King too, did you? Hey, isn't that the exit? Oh, no, you don't. You did win it, didn't you? What did you drop? Tell me. Suddenly, we were both jogging up the stairs. At the end of the gentle curving staircase was a thick door decorated with a relief. The scene was of two swordsmen facing off among gnarled old trees. The left was dark-skinned, and right was pale, but both were slender and fragile, with pointed ears. This picture was meant to represent the theme of the floor ahead. I thought to myself, Nezha, no, Nataku, you were the real MVP of the second floor. Come on back to us. The front line's a scary, dangerous place, but it's where you'll find what you really wanted. And the front line needs you, too, after all. In a way, the third floor is where SAO really starts, I said aloud. Asuna caught up to me, looking puzzled, rather than harassing me more about the LA. Is it? Why is that? I started off with my now familiar, unhelpful refrain. Well... And savoring each and every step, I crossed the final 30 feet of the second floor of Aincrad.